It's 7 in the morning. You're in Tokyo. You grab your coffee, you open your phone, and the weather app loads. Greater Pacific Imperial Zone, Eastern Prefecture, 22 degrees and sunny. Fine. You swipe to the news. Emperor's 82nd birthday celebrations declared a public holiday across the Greater Asia Free Trade Sphere. Interesting. You tap the map out of curiosity, and there it is, the Pacific Ocean, almost entirely shaded in the deep red of the Japanese Empire. And right where Los Angeles should be, there's a small label, Western Garrison District, special entry permit required. You put your coffee down. How did this happen? When did this happen? And more importantly, how close did our actual timeline come to looking exactly like this? Hi, I'm Professor Paradox, and today we're going to do something a little uncomfortable. We're going to go back to a single morning in June 1942, find a decision that took less than 5 minutes, and watch it unravel the entire 20th century. Not through magic, not through fantasy, through logic, through history, and through the very real, very terrifying fragility of the world we think of as inevitable. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about history. The version we got wasn't the only version available. It wasn't even the most likely version. It was just the one that happened.
And it happened because of a fuel tank, a miscommunication, and a very unlucky Tuesday morning in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Let's go back. June 4th, 1942. The Battle of Midway. If you've heard of one Pacific naval engagement from the Second World War, it's this one. And for good reason. In real history, this battle was an absolute catastrophe for Japan. In the span of a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 of its fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. 4 ships, 4 floating air bases, gone. Just like that. To understand how devastating that was, you need to understand what aircraft carriers meant in 1942. This wasn't like losing 4 battleships. Battleships are big and scary, and they look great in photographs. But by 1942, everyone with any strategic sense already understood that the aircraft carrier was the new queen of the ocean. Whoever controlled the carriers controlled the skies. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the sea. And whoever controlled the sea controlled the Pacific. Japan lost 4 of them in a single afternoon, and they never really recovered. The Battle of Midway is widely considered the turning point of the entire Pacific War. After Midway, Japan was on defense. After Midway, the momentum shifted permanently to the United States.
But here's what historians call the 5-minute miracle, and it is genuinely one of the most staggering accidents in military history. 20 in the morning on June 4th, American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown descended on the Japanese fleet. And they caught the Japanese carriers at the absolute worst possible moment. The flight decks were crowded, planes were being rearmed and refueled, torpedoes had been swapped out for bombs, then some were being swapped back. Fuel lines were running across the deck, ammunition was stacked in the open. The carriers were, in the most literal sense, floating bombs waiting for a spark. The American bombers provided the spark. 20 and 10:25, 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, were hit and mortally wounded. The 4th, the Hiryu, survived a few more hours before meeting the same fate. Japan's carrier fleet was effectively destroyed in the time it takes to make a cup of coffee. Now, here is where we make our turn. What if the Japanese flight decks hadn't been in that state? What if, just 1 hour earlier, a Japanese officer, let's say a meticulous, slightly anxious flight operations officer named Furuno, had looked at the chaos on deck and said, "Enough. Clear the planes, move them to the hangar, organize this properly before we launch anything."
What if that one order, that one small bureaucratic decision driven by nothing more than a mild obsession with tidiness had been given? The American bombs would have hit clear steel. They would have caused damage, certainly, maybe significant damage, but not the catastrophic chain reaction explosions that destroyed 3 carriers in 5 minutes. Maybe Japan loses 1 carrier that day, maybe 2, but not 4. And with even 2 carriers surviving,
the entire trajectory of the Pacific War changes. That is our point of divergence. Not a grand ideological shift, not a different Hitler or a different Roosevelt, just a flight deck that was slightly less cluttered on a Tuesday morning in June. That's all it takes. That's always all it takes. So let's follow this thread and see where it goes. With 2 or 3 carriers intact after Midway, Japan does not immediately crumble into a defensive posture. The United States still won a significant engagement, but not the decisive, crushing, momentum-shifting victory that real history recorded. The American Navy is still formidable, but Japan retains enough air power to contest the Pacific, really contest it, not just slow things down. Admiral Yamamoto, rather than spending the rest of the war managing a slow retreat, is now working with a fleet that still has teeth.
And this is where the Japanese High Command starts having conversations that, in real history, were dismissed as reckless, conversations about Hawaii. In real history, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, but never attempted an invasion of Hawaii itself. The logistics were nightmarish, the distance was enormous, and Hawaii had a substantial American military presence. Yamamoto himself reportedly said after Pearl Harbor that he feared they had awakened a sleeping giant. He was right. So in real history, Japan chose not to press the advantage. They struck, they hurt, and retreated to build a defensive perimeter. But this alternate Yamamoto has 2 more carriers than his real counterpart. He has momentum. He has a Japanese military establishment that hasn't been psychologically shattered by Midway. And in late 1942, after months of pressure from the Naval General Staff, an invasion plan for Hawaii is approved. It does not go smoothly. It goes nowhere near smoothly. The logistics are every bit as brutal as the pessimists predicted. Japanese supply lines stretch to their breaking point. The fighting on Oahu is some of the most intense of the entire war. American forces defend with everything they have because everyone understands what Hawaii means. Hawaii is not just a strategic asset. Hawaii is American soil.
Losing it would be psychologically and politically unlike anything the United States had ever experienced. And they lose it. Not quickly, not cleanly, but by the spring of 1943 in this alternate timeline, the stars and stripes come down over Pearl Harbor, and a Japanese garrison flag goes up in its place. And the shockwave that travels through the American political system is almost impossible to overstate. The West Coast of the United States goes into a panic that makes the real history West Coast panic of early 1942 look mild. Japanese submarines are spotted, or rumored to be spotted, off San Francisco, off San Diego, off Seattle. The population of coastal California begins moving east in numbers not seen since the Dust Bowl. Congress holds emergency sessions. Roosevelt, who in real history managed to project an air of calm confidence even after Pearl Harbor, is now facing something genuinely different, a public that believes the American mainland is next. And this panic, this political earthquake, does something strategically catastrophic for the Allied cause in Europe, because the United States Army and Navy are now pouring every available resource into the Pacific. Every ship, every plane, every trained soldier, every gallon of fuel that was earmarked for the European theater is being reconsidered. Churchill is on the phone to Washington almost daily.
And the conversations are increasingly difficult. The plans for Operation Overlord, what would become D-Day in real history, are not canceled, but they are delayed, first by 6 months, then by a year, and then, as 1943 turns into 1944, and the Pacific situation continues to demand resources, by something that begins to look like indefinite postponement. For the Soviet Union, this delay is not an abstraction. It is not a strategic inconvenience. It is a bleeding wound. Joseph Stalin, in real history, was furious about the delay of the Second Front. He made no secret of it. He considered it a betrayal. He believed, not entirely without reason, that the British and Americans were content to let the Soviet Union absorb the worst of Germany's military power, while the Western Allies took their time preparing a comfortable, well-resourced invasion. In real history, the relationship between Stalin and the Western Allies was one of deep mutual suspicion barely papered over by the necessity of a common enemy.
In this alternate 1944, the papering over is no longer working. The Soviet Union has been fighting Germany essentially alone on the Eastern Front for 3 years. Millions of Soviet soldiers are dead. Entire cities have been leveled. The country's industrial capacity, though extraordinary in its resilience, is stretched to the absolute limit.
And every time Stalin asks when the Second Front is coming, the answer from London and Washington is some variation of soon. Soon has been the answer for 3 years. And so, in the spring of 1944, something happens that, in real history, was attempted but never completed. Quiet diplomatic contact between Soviet and German intermediaries. We know these contacts existed in reality. There are documented back-channel communications in 1943, particularly through Stockholm. Nothing ever came of them in real history because Germany's terms were unacceptable, and Stalin ultimately calculated that the Allies would follow through on their promises. But in this alternate timeline, the Allies have not followed through. The Second Front is not coming anytime soon. And Stalin is a man who makes cold, ruthless calculations, without sentimentality. By late 1944, a ceasefire agreement is reached on the Eastern Front. Not a peace, a ceasefire. Germany gets to stop hemorrhaging soldiers into the Russian steppe. The Soviet Union gets to stop losing cities. Both sides get to catch their breath. And both sides, in their own way, start pointing their attention westward. For Germany, a closed Eastern Front means something that should terrify anyone watching from London. The full weight of the Wehrmacht, no longer divided, now focused entirely on Western and Southern Europe.
The Allied forces that have managed to gain footholds in Italy find themselves under pressure they hadn't anticipated. The planned cross-channel invasion, already delayed by the Pacific crisis, now faces a Germany that has transferred dozens of divisions from east to west. Britain is effectively an island under siege. Not in the dramatic sense of the Blitz, but in the grinding, exhausting sense of a country that has been at war for 5 years, whose empire is fraying, whose population is tired, and whose American partner is increasingly distracted by a war on the other side of the world. Now, before we go any further, let me do something I always do when the timeline starts getting complicated. Let me just quickly reorient us because I know this is a lot. The year is late 1944 in this alternate world. Japan controls Hawaii and is the dominant power in the Pacific. The United States is fighting a defensive war in the Pacific while simultaneously trying to support Britain in Europe. Germany and the Soviet Union have reached a ceasefire on the Eastern Front. Britain is isolated and exhausted, and the cross-channel invasion that in real history was the decisive turning point of the European war, it hasn't happened. It may not happen for years if it happens at all. This is the world we're living in now.
Keep that in your head as we move to the next piece of the puzzle, because this is where things get genuinely strange. The Manhattan Project. In real history, the atomic bomb program was initiated with one primary fear, that Germany was developing nuclear weapons and might get there first. The theoretical physics community in the 1930s was international, and a disturbing number of the best nuclear physicists in the world had emigrated from Germany: Einstein, Fermi, Szilard. And they all knew what Germany's remaining scientific establishment was capable of. The bomb had to be built before Hitler got one. As it turned out, Germany's nuclear program was far less advanced than the Allies feared, but the Manhattan Project was already running at full speed by the time that became clear. And then after Germany surrendered in May 1945 in real history, the bomb was used on Japan, first Hiroshima on August 6th, then Nagasaki on August 9th, because Japan showed no signs of surrendering, and an American land invasion of the Japanese home islands was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Now come back to our alternate 1944. The Manhattan Project is still running, the bomb is being built, but the strategic situation has completely changed. Germany has not surrendered. It has, if anything, stabilized.
Japan is not on the verge of defeat. Japan is a dominant Pacific power with a garrison on American soil. And the question of what to do with the atomic bomb when it's ready becomes one of the most agonizing debates in American history. Do you use it on Germany? An invasion of continental Europe hasn't happened, so there's no obvious military target. Berlin is deep inside a continent the Allies don't control, and using a nuclear weapon on a European city with all the political consequences that entails, the reaction of the Soviet Union, which is now an ambiguous quasi-neutral rather than a firm ally, is deeply complicated. Do you use it on Japan?
Japan now controls territory that includes American soil. There is an enormous emotional and political argument for striking back at Japan with everything available. But Japanese forces are dispersed across an enormous arc of Pacific territory. There is no single target whose destruction would end the war the way Hiroshima and Nagasaki did in real history, where the logic was essentially surrender or we will destroy your cities one by one. And here is where the timeline gets its most chilling twist.
Because while the United States is wrestling with these questions, Soviet intelligence, which in real history had already deeply penetrated the Manhattan Project, as we later discovered through the Venona intercepts, is working furiously. In real history, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, less than 4 years after Hiroshima. They were helped substantially by espionage, by the information passed by Klaus Fuchs and others. In this alternate timeline, with the Eastern Front ceasefire in place and the Soviet Union no longer pouring all of its resources into conventional warfare, the nuclear program accelerates, perhaps by a year, perhaps 2. By 1947 or 1948 in this alternate world, the Soviet Union has its own atomic bomb. The United States still has more and more sophisticated delivery systems, but the monopoly is broken. And now the world has its first true nuclear standoff, not between the United States and the Soviet Union alone, but in a triangle: the United States, the Soviet Union, and a Japanese empire that is racing to develop its own program because it has captured enough scientific infrastructure in its Pacific conquests to understand what is coming, and to know that nuclear deterrence is the only thing that will protect its gains in the long run. 3 nuclear powers, 3 mutually hostile blocs, no clear path to resolution.
Welcome to the 1950s in this alternate world. It is a cold peace, so cold it barely qualifies as peace at all. Now, I need to stop here and introduce something that I think gets forgotten in these kinds of historical thought experiments, because we always focus on the decisions of generals and politicians, on the movements of armies and navies, as if the natural world just politely waits for us to finish our wars before it does anything inconvenient. It does not. In December 1944, in real history, a massive typhoon, Typhoon Cobra, sometimes called Halsey's Typhoon, after the American admiral whose fleet sailed directly into it, struck the Philippine Sea with catastrophic force. 3 American destroyers were sunk, nearly 800 sailors died, dozens of aircraft were destroyed. It was one of the worst weather-related naval disasters in American history. And it happened because weather forecasting technology in 1944 was, by today's standards, nearly non-existent. Commanders were working with incomplete information, uncertain models, and the vast, indifferent Pacific. In this alternate December 1944, the geography of the naval war in the Pacific is different. Japanese forces are more widely dispersed. Their supply and communication lines stretch from the Japanese home islands all the way to Hawaii, across thousands of miles of open ocean.
And Typhoon Cobra, because the laws of physics care nothing about alternate history, forms exactly where it forms and travels exactly the path it travels. This time it hits Japanese supply convoys. The damage is significant. Ships are sunk. Supplies destined for the Hawaiian garrison, food, fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, go to the bottom of the Pacific. And this exposes what was always Japan's deepest strategic problem: an empire that expanded faster than it could be sustained. This was true in real history too. Japan's industrial capacity was simply not large enough to support the empire it had seized. It couldn't produce enough ships to replace the ones it lost. It couldn't produce enough fuel to keep its fleet fully operational. It couldn't produce enough food to feed all the populations it now claimed to govern. The Japanese empire in real history was always running on a kind of controlled desperation, always one bad battle or one broken supply line away from crisis. In this alternate timeline, the empire is even larger. It includes Hawaii, and the supply problem is even worse. Typhoon Cobra doesn't end the Japanese empire, but it accelerates its internal rot. It stretches the garrison in Hawaii past its comfortable operational limits.
It triggers a series of internal debates within the Japanese military establishment about whether the Hawaiian occupation is sustainable, about whether resources should be pulled back to consolidate a more defensible perimeter closer to the home islands. And in that debate, the first serious cracks in the alternate Japanese empire begin to appear. Not from American military pressure, not from a decisive battle, but from the slow, grinding impossibility of feeding and supplying too many soldiers in too many places across too much ocean. The same force that brought down the real Japanese empire, just operating on a slightly different timetable. This is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it gets at something important about how history actually works. Empires don't usually fall because they lose a single decisive battle. They fall because they overextend, because the gap between what they control and what they can actually sustain keeps growing until it becomes impossible to bridge. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of one bad day. The British Empire didn't end with one lost war. They expanded until the cost of expansion exceeded the benefit, and then they contracted, messily and painfully over decades. Japan in this alternate timeline has the same fundamental problem as Japan in real history, just slightly delayed and slightly larger in scale.
The question is not whether the empire will eventually contract. The question is what the world looks like when it does, and who fills the space it leaves behind. And the answer to that question is what makes the alternate 1960s and 1970s so fascinating and so strange. Because in a world where the United States never achieved total victory in the Pacific, and where Europe never experienced the clear Allied triumph of real history, and where three nuclear-armed powers are locked in a tense and unstable triangle, the great movements that defined the second half of the real 20th century take very different forms. The Civil Rights Movement in the United States, for instance. In real history, the movement of the 1950s and 1960s drew enormous moral power from the tension between America's stated values, democracy, freedom, equality, and its actual treatment of Black Americans. That tension was always there, but it was sharpened by the Cold War, because the United States was trying to present itself to the world as the champion of freedom against Soviet tyranny, and Soviet propaganda was gleefully pointing to photographs of segregated lunch counters and fire hoses turned on peaceful protesters.
In this alternate United States, a country that lost Hawaii, that has been fighting a grinding Pacific War for over a decade, that has watched Europe fall into a kind of dark equilibrium between German and Soviet power, the national psychology is fundamentally different. There is less triumphalism, there is more siege mentality, and the question of who counts as fully American, who gets to share in the rights and protections of citizenship, becomes both more urgent and more contested in ways that are hard to predict but impossible to ignore. The decolonization movements that swept Asia and Africa in the real 1950s and 1960s also look very different. In real history, these movements operated in a world where the United States and the Soviet Union were competing for influence, and newly independent nations could sometimes leverage that competition to extract concessions and support. In this alternate world, Southeast Asia is mostly under Japanese control. Africa is still largely European colonial territory, but Europe itself is fractured and exhausted. The dynamics of independence movements shift in ways that are impossible to fully trace, but certain to be profound.
Serious, sustained contact between the Japanese Empire and the populations it controls across Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and Hawaii. In real history, we know what Japanese occupation looked like. We have the testimony of survivors from the Philippines, from Korea, from Manchuria, from Nanjing. Japanese occupation in real history was often brutal, marked by forced labor, systematic violence, and a racial hierarchy that placed ethnic Japanese at the top and everyone else somewhere below. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, the official ideology of the Japanese Empire, claimed to be about Asian liberation from Western colonialism. The reality on the ground was often colonial domination by different masters. There is no reason to believe this alternate empire would be fundamentally different in character, especially in its early years. The same military culture, the same racial ideologies, the same institutional patterns. The human cost of this alternate empire
measured in the lives of Filipinos, Indonesians, native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and others living under occupation, would be enormous. This is not a fun alternate timeline to live in if you're one of the hundreds of millions of people under Japanese imperial control.
And I think it's important to be honest about that, rather than treating the whole thing as an interesting intellectual puzzle, while quietly forgetting that every square on the alternate map represents real human beings living real lives under real conditions. At the same time, and this is the uncomfortable part, the real history we actually got was not a story of unambiguous triumph either. The Second World War ended in 1945, but the killing didn't stop. Korea, Vietnam, Algeria, Angola, the Congo. The decades after World War II in real history were full of wars, occupations, and atrocities. They just mostly happened in places that the Western media wasn't paying full attention to. The Cold War's body count, measured in the Vekalit Savashri, the proxy wars, fought in other people's countries with other people's lives, ran into the millions. History is almost never a choice between good and bad. It's usually a choice between different kinds of bad, distributed differently across different populations, with different people bearing the cost, depending on where the lines fall and who happens to be on which side of them. And that brings me back to that moment, that flight deck, that 5-minute window on a Tuesday morning in June 1942.
The version of history we actually got, where Midway was a decisive American victory, where Japan lost 4 carriers, where the tide of the Pacific War turned, was not inevitable. It was not destiny. It was not the universe correcting itself toward a predetermined outcome. It was the result of an extraordinary convergence of American skill, Japanese mistakes, and sheer statistical luck. The American dive bomber pilots who found the Japanese fleet at that precise moment of maximum vulnerability had themselves been lost for hours. They found the fleet almost by accident, following a Japanese destroyer that happened to be heading back to rejoin the main force after chasing an American submarine. Following a destroyer, almost by accident. That is the hinge on which the 20th century turned. And I find that both terrifying and in a strange way, clarifying. Because if history can turn on something that small, a cluttered flight deck, a destroyer heading in the right direction, 5 minutes of clear sky over the Pacific, then it means the future is equally contingent, equally fragile, equally dependent on decisions that seem small in the moment, but compound over time into something enormous. The people making those decisions usually don't know they're making them.
The Japanese officer who didn't order the flight deck cleared that morning wasn't thinking about the fate of empires. He was thinking about the next 30 minutes. Roosevelt wasn't thinking about the next 50 years when he made decisions in 1942. He was thinking about the next 50 days. That's how it always works. The weight of historical consequence falls on decisions made by people who are just trying to get through the afternoon. Which means that somewhere, right now, someone is making a decision that will look obvious in retrospect, obviously right, or obviously catastrophic, and they have no idea. They're just trying to get through the afternoon. I'm Professor Paradox. Thank you for watching. If you've got a historical what-if you want me to pull apart, drop it in the comments. I read them all, I obsess over them, and the good ones keep me up at night, which is exactly how I like it. If this video did something to your brain, if it made you see something differently, or made you a little bit nervous about how contingent everything is, then hit subscribe, because that feeling is basically the entire point of this channel. The world you think of as inevitable was always just one cluttered flight deck away from being something completely different.